Yes, good testimony.
Everyone ready?
Yes.
Shall we start?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, sir. You can see it. That I'm
Welcome.
wearing
Can everyone hear? No? Is that any better? Still not? Can you hear me now? Okay. Welcome and thank you for coming to today's panel on Adlai Stevenson and his tremendous legacy here at the United Nations. I'm Ambassador Alex Wolf, the Deputy Permanent Representative of the United States to the United Nations, and it is an honor for me to be here today with such distinguished guests. I want to begin by thanking all of our panelists for taking the time to come to the UN to share with us their views on the extraordinary life and legacy of Adlai Stevenson. And I would like to add a special thanks to Alvin Liebling for his tireless efforts, both in putting together today's discussion and in honoring Adlai Stevenson's legacy. Stevenson has a lasting place in the pantheon of great U.S. ambassadors to the United Nations. And it's still a thrill for me to sometimes feel as I'm walking in his footsteps and still fighting some of the same battles. Of course, he's famous for his dramatic showdown on the Security Council floor with his Soviet counterpart during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But he also had a far-sighted view of the relatively newly founded UN's use as an important foreign policy instrument and something of a force multiplier for serious efforts to pursue American interests and promote American values. We are honoring Adlai Stevenson's enormous effect on U.S. diplomacy at a time when the U.S. relationship with the UN is itself changing course. The Obama administration recognizes what Adlai Stevenson knew 60 years ago, that the UN may be imperfect, but it is also indispensable in facing the challenges of the day. Of course, a lot has changed. For one thing, the UN is a very different place. Peacekeeping was barely in its infancy in Stevenson's day. The UN's development and humanitarian efforts have also expanded dramatically over the decades. And the old Cold War tensions that dominated so much of Stevenson's tenure are blessedly fading memory. But with a new age comes new challenges, including global problems that by their very definition demand global solutions. Consider such transnational threats such as nuclear proliferation, genocide and mass atrocities, cyber attacks on our digital infrastructure, international crime and drug trafficking, pandemics, and a climate that is warming by the day. These challenges pay no heed to borders, and they cannot be tackled by any one country alone. As President Obama has noted, all nations have not only rights, but responsibilities. We must all work together to meet these common challenges. And that makes the United Nations particularly vital to the efforts of the United States to craft a better, safer world. As we strive to do so, we are conscious that Ambassador Stevenson left us some awfully big shoes to fill. His tenure is remembered with great respect within the halls of the United Nations, as well as at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. He was the consummate diplomat. His wit, wisdom, civility, and decency transcended all language barriers and cultural differences. And I must admit that his famous eloquence still makes this administration marvel, though with one noteworthy exception. It must be something about Illinois. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was a model of both strong American leadership and determined diplomacy in the Security Council. And as his son once put it, Ambassador Stevenson was devoid of dogma, but never devoid of principle. Stevenson viewed the United Nations as the court of world opinion, as he famously told his Soviet counterpart, and he placed great value and importance on international law. But Stevenson did not just work at the United Nations. He also helped build it. We often forget that he was at the forefront of the efforts in 1945 that led to the founding of this organization. From the San Francisco Conference through his tour in New York, the dignity and vision with which he represented the United States on the world stage continues to inspire us all. Now let me invite our distinguished panel to reflect on Adlai Stevenson's legacy. I have the distinct honor of introducing our moderator for the afternoon, also a former U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations and a former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Ambassador Thomas Pickering, one of the most distinguished and capable American diplomats of our times. Ambassador Pickering served in the Foreign Service for 4 decades, achieving the personal distinction of Career Ambassador, the highest rank in the U.S. Foreign Service. Ambassador Pickering's exceptional tenure included ambassadorships in Jordan, Nigeria, El Salvador, Israel, India, Russia, and of course here at the United Nations, a record I suspect won't be equaled. He has been a trusted advisor at the highest levels to presidents of both parties. Ambassador Pickering was appointed UN ambassador by President George H.W. Bush and was an integral part of his administration's handling of the Gulf War, skillfully leading the United Nations Security Council's response to the 1990 Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Ambassador Pickering was later appointed Undersecretary for Political Affairs by President Bill Clinton and Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. And without further ado, let us give a warm welcome to our moderator, Ambassador Tom Pickering.
Thank you, Al.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Wolf, not only for your very kind and very warm and generous introduction of me, but even more importantly, for your very, very fine words on Adlai Stevenson and his legacy here, about which we will hear a great deal more. You have not been, I think, formally introduced to Ambassador Wolf, and I will only say, in words of few syllables, you have by his words, but by his record, which also speaks well, I would only mention 2 things. Ambassador Wolf had the distinction of being both Madeleine Albright's executive assistant for her full period of service as Secretary of State, and then later came to New York to be John Bolton's deputy here. He performed in both with distinction and honor, and his record speaks for itself. The next item is my pleasure to introduce to you, for a few words of greeting, Ambassador Thomas Miller, who is President of the United Nations Association of the United States, many of whose members have gathered with us here today to join this meeting. Ambassador Miller was ambassador to Greece and ambassador to Bosnia. He ran one of the world's largest organizations dealing with particularly support for children around the world. And his career graced 30 years of foreign service. In each job, he performed admirably. And without further ado, I will ask Tom to come and take what has now become the hot seat and say his words of greeting to you. Tom, it's a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Tom. This is the rotating seat. I think Tom will come back here and stay. It's a pleasure to be here, and I greet many friends and colleagues here. It's also a real pleasure when Judge Liebling asked me if I would say a few words, and I was thrilled to do so because I grew up just a few miles from where Adlai Stevenson called home in Libertyville, Illinois. So thank you so very much for giving me this honor, sir. There are so many UNA members here, and so when I was thinking of what to say, I'm not going to tell you what you all know already about your wonderful organization. I will note that many of our members are former UN employees, many of whom served, or some of whom served in very high-level positions, and former U.S. government employees. We have a tremendous wealth. Our richness is in the people we've got in this organization. I look at people like Molly, and if I start naming names, I'll never finish. I think UNA very much tries to live up to the legacy of Adlai Stevenson. It's an organization that is open, that seeks to connect with the American people, very much as you can call him Governor Stevenson, you can call him Ambassador Stevenson, you can call him Candidate Stevenson. He had so many different titles and so many different roles. It's an organization that's passionate on the issues, very much like Governor Stevenson was. I'm from Illinois, so I'm going to call him Governor Stevenson. Very, very passionate on the issues that are before our government and before the United Nations today. And I would just cite one for you, something that I'm very honored that Tom Pickering was very much a part of, and that's the leadership that we've taken in trying to get the U.S. government to sign on to conventions that we have often taken the lead on the issues, but we haven't signed the underlying conventions. It's an organization that tries to work very much with young people through our Global Classrooms program, something that we're very proud of. I call Global Classrooms Model UN on steroids. And it's a great program working in underserved areas. And again, to hark back to Adlai Stevenson, our flagship program is in Chicago, not surprisingly, the first big city in the United States to mainstream in its curriculum our Global Classroom programs. Very much Adlai Stevenson connected with young people, very, very much. And it's an organization that its heart is at its grassroots. Its heart is involved in getting citizens involved in the issues. We do this through our 135 chapters, our 12,000 members throughout the country. Today you honor Adlai Stevenson's role primarily in the UN. As a child growing up, I knew him very much, not personally, but as a governor of the great state of Illinois. He also was a two-time presidential candidate who I would say was way, way ahead of his time, and the time has finally caught up to him today. Adlai Stevenson stood for very much the kind of ideals that the UNA stands for, all that is good in this country, multilateralism, not as an argument but as a principle, and as an instrument to advance U.S. foreign policy, civility, eloquence, all the nice words that Alex has already used, and most of all, principle. And I think that's something I'm very, very proud to say the UNA, United Nations Association, very much stands for. Adlai Stevenson set a legacy that we're all very proud of, and I think those of us in the United Nations Association are very proud to be here today. Judge, thank you once again for inviting us to join you, and I wish you well. Thank you.
Thank you.
How do I turn my mic on?
Thank you again, Tom, very much for those warm words. And let me, before I proceed further, only say to Ambassador Wolf how much we appreciate the sponsorship of the United States mission to the United Nations, and indeed, Alex, your work and the work of all your staff who have made us welcome guests across the street here at the United Nations and the Economic and Social Council. And thank you all for coming out. As moderator, I have two wonderful opportunities here. One is to say a few words, which I will in a minute, about Adlai Stevenson, a recollection for me and a legacy. And the second is to moderate this meeting. And I will do that by introducing, as we go ahead, each of the speakers in turn. Subjecting you to 6 or 7 biographies all at once is deadening, uninspiring, and probably unnecessary. But I will try to provide a few choice words about each of the individuals. You have biographies of most, but not all of them, in your programs. Let me also say that I had the special pleasure of beginning my service here some 27 years after Governor Stevenson. And 27 years after I left, we're back again. That covers a long time. But I had the special pleasure in the early 60s of serving here